Well now, I do believe it's 6 o'clock. I hope I'm right. Hello everyone. Time for Tales and Cocktails, and tonight I have a very strange story by a favorite author, Neil Gaiman. I didn't say anything before about Neil Gaiman. I read another piece of his, October in the Chair, about the seasons sitting around and then giving their various stories. But on the back cover, inside back cover, Neil Gaiman is the #1 New York Times best-selling author of the novels Anansi Boys, American Gods, Coraline, Neverwhere, Stardust, and Good Omens, which he wrote with Terry Pratchett. The Sandman series of graphic novels, and the story collections Smoke and Mirrors and Fragile Things, and this is from Fragile Things. Among his many awards are the Bram Stoker World Fantasy and Locus Awards. Originally from England, he now lives in America. Excuse me. So, this is obviously by Neil Gaiman, and it's a short story called Closing Time. It's a strange story, and I love it. There are still clubs in London, old ones and mock old, with elderly sofas and crackling fireplaces, newspapers, and traditions of speech or of silence, and new clubs, the Groucho and its many knockoffs, where actors and journalists go to be seen, to drink, to enjoy their glowering solitude, or even to talk. I have friends in both kinds of club, but I'm not myself a member of any club in London. Not anymore. Years ago, half a lifetime, when I was a young journalist, I joined a club. It existed solely to take advantage of the licensing laws of the day, which forced all pubs to stop serving drinks at 11 p.m., closing time. This pub, the Diogenes, was a one-room affair located above a record shop in a narrow alley just off the Tottenham Court Road. It was owned by a cheerful, chubby, alcohol-fueled woman called Nora, who would tell anyone who asked, and even if they didn't, that she'd called the club the Diogenes Darling because she was still looking for an honest man. Up a narrow flight of steps, and at Nora's whim, the door to the club would be open or not. It kept irregular hours. It was a place to go to once the pubs closed. That was all it ever was. And despite Nora's doomed attempts to serve food or even to send out a cheery monthly newsletter to all her club's members, reminding them that the club now served food, that was all it ever would be. I was saddened several years ago when I heard that Nora had died, and I was struck, to my surprise, with a real sense of desolation last month when, on a visit to England, walking down that alley, I tried to figure out where the Diogenes Club had been, and looked first in the wrong place. Then saw the faded green cloth awnings shading the windows of a tapas restaurant above a mobile phone shop, and painted on them a stylized man in a barrel. It seemed almost indecent, and it set me remembering. There were no fireplaces in the Diogenes Club, and no armchairs either, but still, stories were told. Most of the people drinking there were men, although women passed through from time to time, and Nora had recently acquired a glamorous permanent fixture in the shape of a deputy, a blonde Polish emigre who called everybody Dolink and who helped herself to drinks whenever she got behind the bar. When she was drunk, she would tell us that she was by rights a countess back in Poland and swear us all to secrecy. There were actors and writers, of course, film editors, broadcasters, police inspectors, and drunks. People who did not keep fixed hours. People who stayed out too late or did not want to go home. Some nights there might be a dozen people there or more. Other nights I'd wander in and I'd be the only person around. On those occasions, I'd buy myself a single drink, drink it down, and then leave. That night it was raining, and there were 4 of us in the club after midnight. Nora and her deputy were sitting up at the bar, working on their sitcom. It was about a chubby but cheerful woman who owned a drinking club, and her scatty deputy, an aristocratic foreign blonde who made amusing English mistakes. It would be like Cheers, Nora used to tell people. She named the comical Jewish landlord after me. Sometimes they would ask me to read a script. There was an actor named Paul, commonly known as Paul the actor, to stop people confusing him with Paul the police inspector or Paul the struck-off plastic surgeon, who were also regulars, a computer gaming magazine editor named Martin, and me. We knew each other vaguely, and the 3 of us sat at a table by the window and watched the rain come down, misting and blurring the lights of the alley. There was another man there, older by far than any of the 3 of us. He was cadaverous and gray-haired and painfully thin, and he sat alone in the corner and nursed a single whiskey. The elbows of his tweed jacket were patched with brown leather, I remember. I remember that quite vividly. He did not talk to us or read or do anything. He just sat, looking out at the rain and the alley beneath, and sometimes he sipped his whiskey without any visible pleasure. It was almost midnight, and Paul and Martin and I had started telling ghost stories. I had just finished telling them a sworn true ghostly account from my school days, the tale of the Green Hand. It had been an article of faith at my prep school that there was a disembodied, luminous hand that was seen from time to time by unfortunate schoolboys. If you saw the Green Hand, you would die soon after. Fortunately, none of us were ever unlucky enough to encounter it, but there were sad tales of boys from before our time, boys who saw the Green Hand and whose 13-year-old hair had turned white overnight. According to school legend, they were taken to the sanatorium, where they would expire after a week or so without ever being able to utter another word. "Hang on," said Paul the actor. "If they never uttered another word, how did anyone know they'd seen the Green Hand? I mean, they could have seen anything." As a boy being told the stories, I had not thought to ask this, and now it was pointed out to me it did seem somewhat problematic. "Perhaps they wrote something down," I suggested, a bit lamely. We batted it about for a while and agreed that the Green Hand was a most unsatisfactory sort of ghost. Then Paul told us a true story about a friend of his who had picked up a hitchhiker and dropped her off at a place she said was her house. And when he went back the next morning, it turned out to be a cemetery. I mentioned that exactly the same thing had happened to a friend of mine as well. Martin said that it had not only happened to a friend of his, but because the hitchhiking girl looked so cold, the friend had lent her his coat. And the next morning, in the cemetery, he found his coat all neatly folded on her grave. Martin went and got another round of drinks, and we wondered why all these ghost women were zooming around the country at night and hitchhiking home. And Martin said that probably living hitchhikers these days were the exception, not the rule. And then one of us said, "I'll tell you a true story if you like. It's a story I've never told a living soul. It's true. It happened to me, not to a friend of mine. But I don't know if it's a ghost story. It probably isn't." This was over 20 years ago. I have forgotten so many things, but I have not forgotten that night or how it ended. This is the story that was told that night in the Diogenes Club. I was 9 years old or thereabouts in the late 1960s, and I was attending a small private school not far from my home. I was only at that school less than a year, long enough to take a dislike to the school's owner, who had bought the school in order to close it and to sell the prime land on which it stood to property developers, which, shortly after I left, she did. For a long time, a year or more, after the school closed, the building stood empty before it was finally demolished and replaced by offices. Being a boy, I was also a burglar of sorts, and one day before it was knocked down, curious, I went back there. I wriggled through a half-open window and walked through empty classrooms that still smelled of chalk dust. I took only one thing from my visit, a painting I had done in art of a little house with a red door knocker like a little devil or an imp. It had my name on it, and it was up on a wall. I took it home. When the school was still open, I walked home each day through the town, then down a dark road cut through sandstone hills and all grown over with trees, and past an abandoned gatehouse. Then there would be light, and the road would go past fields, and finally I would be home. Back then there were so many old houses and estates, Victorian relics that stood in an empty half-life awaiting the bulldozers that would transform them and their ramshackle grounds into blandly identical landscapes of desirable modern residences. Every house neatly arranged side by side around roads that went nowhere. The other children I encountered on my way home were, in my memory, always boys. We did not know each other, but like guerrillas in occupied territory, we would exchange information. We were scared of adults, not each other. We did not have to know each other to run in twos or threes or in packs. The day that I'm thinking of, I was walking home from school and I met 3 boys on the road where it was at its darkest. They were looking for something in the ditches and the hedges and the weed-choked place in front of the abandoned gatehouse. They were older than me. "What are you looking for?" The tallest of them, a beanpole of a boy with dark hair and a sharp face, said, "Look." He held up several ripped-in-half pages from what must have been a very, very old pornographic magazine. The girls were all in black and white, and their hairstyles looked like the ones my great-aunts had in old photographs. Fragments of it had blown all over the road and into the abandoned gatehouse front garden. I joined in the paper chase. Together, the 3 of us retrieved almost a whole copy of The Gentleman's Relish from that dark place. Then we climbed over a wall into a deserted apple orchard and looked at what we had gathered. Naked women from a long time ago. There is a smell of fresh apples and of rotten apples moldering down into cider, which even today brings back the idea of the forbidden to me. The smaller boys, who were still bigger than I was, were called Simon and Douglas, and the tall one, who might have been as old as 15, was called Jamie. I wondered if they were brothers. I did not ask. When we had all looked at the magazine, they said, "We're going to hide this in our special place. Do you want to come along? You mustn't tell if you do. You mustn't tell anyone." They made me spit on my palm, and they spat on theirs, and we pressed our hands together. Their special place was an abandoned metal water tower in a field by the entrance to the lane near to where I lived. We climbed a high ladder. The tower was painted a dull green on the outside, but inside it was orange with rust, which covered the floor and the walls. There was a wallet on the floor with no money in it, only some cigarette cards. Jamie showed them to me. Each card held a painting of a cricketer from a long time ago. They put the pages of the magazine down on the floor of the water tower and the wallet on top of it. Then Douglas said, "I say we go back to the Swallows next." My house was not far from the Swallows, a sprawling manor house set back from the road. It had been owned, my father had told me once, by the Earl of Tenterden, but when he had died, his son, the new Earl, had simply closed the place up. I had wandered to the edges of the grounds, but had not gone further in. It did not feel abandoned. The gardens were too well cared for, and where there are gardeners, there are gardeners. Somewhere there had to be an adult. I told them this. Jamie said, "Bet there's not. Probably just someone who comes in and cuts the grass once a month or something. You're not scared, are you? We've been here hundreds of times. Thousands." Of course I was scared. And of course I said that I was not. We went up the main drive until we reached the main gates. They were closed, and we squeezed beneath the bars to get in. Rhododendron bushes lined the drive. Before we got to the house, there was what I took to be a groundkeeper's cottage, and beside it on the grass were some rusty metal cages, big enough to hold a hunting dog or a boy. We walked past them, up to a horseshoe-shaped drive, and right up to the front door of the Swallows. We peered inside, looking in the windows, but seeing nothing. It was too dark inside. We slipped around the house, through a rhododendron thicket, and out again, into some kind of fairyland. It was a magical grotto, all rocks and delicate ferns and odd exotic plants I'd never seen before. Plants with purple leaves and leaves like fronds and small half-hidden flowers like jewels. A tiny stream wound through it, a rill of water running from rock to rock. Douglas said, "I'm going to wee-wee in it." It was very matter-of-fact. He walked over to it, pulled down his shorts, and urinated in the stream, splashing on the rocks. The other boys did it too, both of them pulling out their penises and standing beside him to piss into the stream. I was shocked. I remember that. I suppose I was shocked by the joy they took in this, or just by the way they were doing something like that in such a special place, spoiling the clear water and the magic of the place, making it into a toilet. It seemed wrong. When they were done, they did not put their penises away. They shook them. They pointed them at me. Jamie had hair growing at the base of his. "We're Cavaliers," said Jamie. "Do you know what that means?" I knew about the English Civil War. Cavaliers, wrong but romantic, versus Roundheads, right but repulsive. But I didn't think that was what he was talking about. I shook my head. "It means our willies aren't circumcised," he explained. "Are you a Cavalier or a Roundhead?" I knew what they meant now. I muttered, "I'm a Roundhead." "Show us. Go on, get it out." "No, it's none of your business." For a moment, I thought things were going to get nasty, but then Jamie laughed and put his penis away, and the others did the same. They told dirty jokes to each other then, jokes I really didn't understand, for all that I was a bright child, but I heard and remembered them, and several weeks later was almost expelled from school for telling one of them to a boy who went home and told it to his parents. The the joke had the word fuck in it. That was the first time I ever heard the word in a dirty joke in a fairy grotto. The principal called my parents into the school after I got in trouble and said that I'd said something so bad they could not repeat it, not even to tell my parents what I'd done. My mother asked me when we got home that night. "Fuck," I said. "You must never, ever say that word," said my mother. She said this very firmly and quietly, and for my own good. That is the worst word anyone can say. I promised her that I wouldn't. But after, amazed at the power a single word could have, I would whisper it to myself when I was alone. In the grotto that autumn afternoon after school, the three big boys told jokes, and they laughed, and I laughed too, although I did not understand any of what they were laughing about. We moved on from the grotto, into the formal gardens and over a small bridge that spanned a pond. We crossed it nervously because it was out in the open, but we could see huge goldfish in the blackness of the pond below, which made it worthwhile. Then Jamie led Douglas and Simon and me down a gravel path into some woodland. Unlike the gardens, the woods were abandoned and unkempt. They felt like there was no one around. The path was grown over. It led between trees and then, after a while, into a clearing. In the clearing was a little house. It was a playhouse, built perhaps 40 years earlier for a child or for children. The windows were Tudor style, leaded and crisscrossed into diamonds. The roof was mock Tudor. A stone path led straight from where we were to the front door. Together we walked up the path to the door. Hanging from the door was a metal knocker. It was painted crimson and had been cast in the shape of some kind of imp, some kind of grinning pixie or demon, cross-legged, hanging by its hands from a hinge. Let me see. How can I describe this best? It wasn't a good thing. The expression on its face, for starters. I found myself wondering what kind of a person would hang something like that on a playhouse door. It frightened me, there in that clearing, with the dusk gathering under the trees. I walked away from the house, back to a safe distance, and the others followed me. I think I have to go home now, I said. It was the wrong thing to say. The three of them turned and laughed and jeered at me, called me pathetic, called me a baby. They weren't scared of the house, they said. I dare you, said Jamie. I dare you to knock on the door. I shook my head. If you don't knock on the door, said Douglas, you're too much of a baby ever to play with us again. I had no desire ever to play with them again. They seemed like occupants of a land I was not yet ready to enter. But still, I did not want them to think me a baby. Go on, we're not scared, said Simon. I tried to remember the tone of voice he used. Was he frightened too and covering it with bravado? Or was he amused? It's been so long. I wish I knew. I walked slowly back up the flagstone path to the house. I reached up, grabbed the grinning imp in my right hand, and banged it hard against the door. Or rather, I tried to bang it hard, just to show the other three that I was not afraid at all, that I was not afraid of anything. But something happened, something I had not expected, and the knocker hit the door with a muffled sort of a thump. Now you have to go inside, shouted Jamie. He was excited. I could hear it. I found myself wondering if they had known about this place already, before we came, if I was the first person they had brought there. But I did not move. You go in, I said. I knocked on the door. I did it like you said. Now you have to go inside. I dare you. I dare all of you. I wasn't going in. I was perfectly certain of that. Not then, not ever. I'd felt something move. I'd felt the knocker twist under my hand as I banged that grinning imp down on the door. I was not so old that I would deny my own senses. They said nothing. They did not move. Then, slowly, the door fell open. Perhaps they thought that I, standing by the door, had pushed it open. Perhaps they thought that I jarred it when I knocked. But I hadn't. I was certain of that. It opened because it was ready. I should have run then. My heart was pounding in my chest, but the devil was in me. And instead of running, I looked at the three big boys at the bottom of the path, and I simply said, "Or are you scared?" They walked up the path toward the little house. "It's getting dark," said Douglas. Then the three boys walked past me, and one by one, reluctantly perhaps, they entered the playhouse. A white face turned to look at me as they went into that room, to ask why I wasn't following them in, I'll bet. But as Simon, who was the last of them, walked in, the door banged shut behind them, and I swear to God I did not touch it. The imp grinned down at me from the wooden door, a vivid splash of crimson in the gray gloaming. I walked around to the side of the playhouse and peered through all the windows one by one into the dark and empty room. Nothing moved in there. I wondered if the other three were inside hiding from me, pressed against the wall, trying their damnedest to stifle their giggles. I wondered if it was a big boy game. I didn't know. I couldn't tell. I stood there in the courtyard of the playhouse while the sky got darker, just waiting. The moon rose after a while, a big autumn moon the color of honey. And then, after a while, the door opened, and nothing came out. Now I was alone in the glade, as alone as if there had never been anyone else there at all. An owl hooted, and I realized that I was free to go. I turned and walked away, following a different path out of the glade, always keeping my distance from the main house. I climbed a fence in the moonlight, ripping the seat of my school shorts, and I walked, not ran. I didn't need to run. Across a field of barley stubble and over a stile, and into a flinty lane that would take me, if I followed it far enough, all the way to my house. And soon enough, I was home. My parents had not been worried, although they were irritated by the orange rust dust on my clothes, by the rip in my shorts. "Where were you anyway?" my mother asked. "I went for a walk," I said. "I lost track of time." And that was where we left it. It was almost 2 a.m. The Polish countess had already gone. Now Nora began noisily to collect up the glasses and ashtrays and to wipe down the bar. "This place is haunted," she said cheerfully. "Not that it's ever bothered me. I like a bit of company, darlings. If I didn't, I wouldn't have opened the club. Now, don't you have homes to go to?" We said our goodnights to Nora, and she made each of us kiss her on her cheek, and she closed the door of the Diogenes Club behind us. We walked down the narrow steps past the record shop, down into the alley, and back into civilization. The underground had stopped running hours ago, but there were always night buses and cabs still out there for those who could afford them. I couldn't, not in those days. The Diogenes Club itself closed several years later, finished off by Nora's cancer, and I suppose by the easy availability of late-night alcohol once the English licenses laws were changed. But I rarely went back after that night. "Was there ever," asked Paul the actor as we hit the street, "any news of those 3 boys? Did you see them again? Or were they reported as missing?" "Neither," said the storyteller. I mean, I never saw them again, and there was no local manhunt for those 3 missing boys, or if there was, I never heard about it. Is the playhouse still there? Asked Martin. I don't know, admitted the storyteller. Well, said Martin, as we reached the Tottenham Court Road and headed for the night bus stop, I, for one, do not believe a word of it. There were 4 of us, not 3, out on the street long after closing time. I should have mentioned that before. There was still one of us who had not spoken, the elderly man with the leather elbow patches who had left the club with the 3 of us. And now he spoke for the first time. I believe it, he said mildly. His voice was frail, almost apologetic. I cannot explain it, but I believe it. Jamie died, you know, not long after Father did. It was Douglas who wouldn't go back, who sold the old place. He wanted them to tear it all down, but they kept the house itself, the Swallows. They weren't going to knock that down. I imagine that everything else must be gone by now. It was a cold night, and the rain still spat occasional drizzle. I shivered, but only because I was cold. Those cages you mentioned, he said, by the driveway. I haven't thought of them in 50 years. When we were bad, he'd lock us up in them. We must have been bad a great deal, eh? Very naughty, naughty boys. He was looking up and down the Tottenham Court Road as if he were looking for something. Then he said, Douglas killed himself, of course, 10 years ago, when I was still in the bin. So my memory's not as good. Not as good as it was. But that was Jamie, all right, to the life. He'd never let us forget that he was the oldest. And you know, we weren't ever allowed in the playhouse. Father didn't build it for us. His voice quavered, and for a moment I could imagine this pale old man as a boy again. Father had his own games. And then he waved his arm and called, "Taxi!" And a taxi pulled over to the curb. "Brown's Hotel," said the man, and he got in. He did not say goodnight to any of us. He pulled shut the door of the cab. And in the closing of the cab door, I could hear too many other doors closing. Doors in the past, which are gone now and cannot be reopened. Closing Time by Neil Gaiman. I hope you enjoyed it, my dear. He is such a very special author, such a very special writer, and his imagination is wonderful. So that is Tales and Cocktails for this Wednesday, and I look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday at 6 o'clock. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this story. Good night.